Okay, you guys, so since we started with square roots, now we need to review imaginary numbers. So let's go back to imaginary numbers. So the equations such as x squared plus 1 equals 0 have no real solutions. So mathematicians define the imaginary numbers to represent their solutions. The imaginary unit, so we use a I in script, is defined as I is equal to the square root of -1. This is useful when working with square roots of negative numbers. A pure imaginary number is written in the form b and then I, where b is the real number and I is the imaginary part. So we have a couple steps when simplifying negative square roots. So we are going to start by rewriting a negative square root as -1 times the number. You got to break a down if it's not a perfect square, and then you simplify the radical, recalling that -1 is really just an imaginary number. So let's do all these examples here for simplifying. So I'm going to break apart -9 as -1 times 9. From there, I know the square root of -1 is your imaginary number, and the square root of 9 is 3, so it's 3i. We're going to do the same thing with the next one. I'm going to break it apart into -1 times 196. Square root of 196 is 14. The square root of -1 is I, so it's going to be 14i. The next one, square root of -5. So that's square root of -1 times 5. 5 doesn't break down any further, but I goes in front of the square root of 5. That way we get rid of that negative. You should never have a negative under the square root. Let's look at number 4. We're going to split it up into -1 times 80. But then the 80 could be split up even more. I'm thinking 16 and 5. All right, so I know the square root of -1 is an I. I know the square root of 16 is 4. And I don't know the square root of 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write 4i square root of 5. Always make sure the I comes after the whole number, and the square root always goes towards the end. We're going to do the same thing with square root of -32. I know it's -1 times 32. Isn't that 16 and 2? Yep, so then it's square root of -1, square root of 16, square root of 2. I know that's I, that's 4, and that stays the same. So that's 4i square root of 2. Let's do the last one, square root of 192. So that's -1 times 64 times 3, right? 64 times 3 gives me that 192. So I gotta take the square root of each. That's I, that's 8, so 8i square root of 3. All right, so that's just simplifying. Next, we're going to go into solving equations, and all these equations are kind of set up like this: ax squared plus c equals 0. So we do have to do a little bit of math before we go through and finish the solving, so let's start. So we're going to start by subtracting 81. So I get -81 equals x squared. To undo the x squared, we take the square root. All right, you can't have a negative in there, so we're going to make your answer have an I on the outside. And the square root of 81 is 9, so it's plus or minus 9i. Let's do the same thing for number 8. I'm going to start by subtracting 9. I get -8 equals 2x squared. I could divide by 2. I get x squared equals -4. I still have to take the square root. So then, right, I'm going to have an I, and the square root of 4 is 2. We're going to do the plus minus. We'll do the same thing with number 9. I'm going to subtract 15 from both sides. I get negative 24 equals 4x squared. My last step is divide by 4. So x squared equals negative 6. Square root it. So 6 doesn't break down, so I'm just going to pull an I in front to get rid of the negative. Square root of 6. And we'll put the little plus minus in front. Let's look at number 10. Subtract 13. I get negative 12 equal x squared. I'm going to take the square root. Okay, this could be broken up into 3 and 4. And then remember, we're going to do the square root of negative 1 because it's still negative in there. I know the square root of 4 is 2, and that one's I, so we're going to put 2i in the front and then leave the square root of 3. I'll leave that there so you guys see, because you guys complained about me flipping too quickly. We're just going to do 2 more on the back, and then I'm actually splitting this video into 2 videos because this is a lot for one day. So let's just do 11 and 12, and then tomorrow you're going to view the next video. Otherwise, this would be like a 20-minute video. Let's start. We're going to add 5 to both sides. When I do that, I get negative 441 equals 3x squared. Then I'm going to divide by 3. So now I'm left with x squared equals negative 147. So I got to take the square root. All right, so for this one, I know I end up finding out that, right, we have a negative 1, 49, and 3. So this is an I, this is a 7, and that stays square root of 3. So your final answer should be 7i square root of 3 plus or minus. The last one, ooh, I love the fraction. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. I get 18 equals negative 2/3 x squared. When you have a fraction, that means you multiply by the reciprocal. So that means you're multiplying by negative 3 over 2. So I get x squared equals 18 times negative 3 over 2 is negative 27. Ooh, that's an easy one. To split up, I have a negative 1, I have a 9, and a 3. If I was to take the square root of each, that gives me an I, and that gives me a 3. And then I don't know the square root of 3, so I leave it as square root 3. Oh, and don't forget the plus minus. So we'll end our video there just because that was a lot.